go. Hope you can all see me. Today is Saturday. It's the day, a couple days after Thanksgiving actually. And I had a good Thanksgiving. How about you? Hope everything was great. And today what I wanted to do was spend a little time talking about the 5 questions that we had done earlier in the week before we left for vacation. And they're on your worksheet, the one that says Reading and Questions, pages 198 to 215. And I wanted to go over the first 5 questions with you in order to make sure that you got those answers correct and you had a chance to take some extra notes on them. So if that's okay with you and you've got your sheet out, I thought we would go through some of that information, and if you have questions beyond what we talk about here today, you can ask me that when we get to class. Okay, so have your sheet with you, and we'll take a look at each one of the questions individually. I'm just going to shut the door to my daughter's room because family around and it might get a little loud. Okay, so here we are, back in the room of Caroline, my daughter, who is now back at school at Penn State. So she allows me to use this room to put the computer and just use it for all kinds of stuff, which is nice of her. Okay, so let's look at number 1. The first question, and I'm just going to look down and check the question out so that I know what we're talking about. And it says, what are some of the economic challenges that the Continental Congress faced, and what did they do to finance the war? And looking at some of your questions earlier, most of you understood that they had a lot of challenges, economic challenges. The war was very expensive. The Congress had to print their own continental dollars to pay for it. And most of you put that down as an answer. But the currency itself loses its value because all they were doing was printing paper money, and it wasn't backed by anything. There were no reserves of gold or silver. So when you have devalued money, much like what we see today, inflation occurs, and that's exactly what happened when the continental money became devalued. And states were also printing their own paper money, so you had all kinds of money flowing everywhere and nobody really knowing what was worth what, and who could use this money and where you could use it. So the Congress, the Continental Congress, was forced to borrow some hard money, you know, silver and gold, from very wealthy men in exchange for certificates of debt. Meaning that once they loaned the Continental Congress this money, the Congress had to be sure to pay it back. So they had to repay the money with interest once the war was over. And in order to pay the soldiers, the Congress had to issue land grant certificates, which quickly became a good form of negotiable currency because land is valuable and you knew where it was, so you could offer that as a payment for money that you owed. The second question is kind of similar to that, and it says that the colonists, before they committed to independence, they faced the likelihood of serious military conflict. How did they get ready for war? And you can continue to talk about financing the war, that they had to pay for this military buildup. The Congress issued paper currency, but no gold or silver to back it up. The currency continued to depreciate, in other words, become less and less valuable, and caused inflation, which is not a good thing in an economy, and certainly that leads to more smuggling, because if you can't pay for something outright, there might be a way for you to kind of smuggle or black market some goods, and that leads to economic corruption. They had to raise an army, so they had to turn some of these colonial militias, some of these state militias, into Continental Army members, and that meant that now these state militia, these state army corps, had to conform to a different style of maybe fighting, a different hierarchy. In other words, people that maybe they didn't listen to normally in everyday life in their state militias, now they had to conform to listening to someone with a higher rank in this Continental Army. And that was difficult, and they had to become more disciplined to become a better fighting group. And certainly the numbers of troops were fluctuating. You know, in some areas you might have had steady troop involvement, in some states maybe not so much, maybe depending on the time of the year. You have farmers who couldn't commit to long periods of time being away from their farms or from their shops or from their form of business, so they had to kind of come and go as they could. So it was difficult to have steady troop involvement, especially when you knew that you didn't know when the next military engagement was going to be. There was a lot of time between battles, so there was some preparation time to pull more troops in if you knew that that was going to happen. If you didn't, that's what led to some difficult engagements for the colonists as well as for the British, because they weren't really prepared. One of the things you'll read about, and you probably already knew this, I'm not telling you anything new, that the colonists were going to benefit very greatly from an alliance with France. Some informal aid, but much later, a very strong naval or ships that were coming in with troops to help support the colonists. And certainly just the fact that the French were willing to recognize the colonists as a group of people who were fighting the British and wanted to become independent. But they suffered, however, for their inability to build effective alliances with the Indians. And you read a little bit about how the Indians felt very conflicted. They tried to stay neutral, but many of the Native American groups gave their support to the British because they were hoping to gain something from that alliance. And this idea of loyalty, the Americans, the colonists, really recognized that military success depended in large part in cultivating and enforcing that loyalty. The Congress and the local governments did establish some punishments for the colonists, the radicals, who refused to follow the Patriot way but wanted to remain loyal to the king. The Patriots began to form real grassroots kinds of organizations like the Committees of Correspondence to strengthen the support of their cause. So they had to try to get people behind the radical, the patriot side, and were trying to make it evident that if you didn't, something bad would probably happen to you, whether it was physically or economically, certainly in terms of what would happen after the war was over. You know, everybody wants you to be on their side, so there are some persuasive measures. Okay, so that was number 2. And number 3 talks about who were the Loyalists, and what was their role, what was the role of African Americans, women, and American Indians during this Revolutionary War. And you read quite a bit about this. Sort of goes with number 3 and 4, because number 4 talks about American colonists fighting each other. So what are, if we can kind of combine 3 and 4 together, what were the Loyalists? Who were they made up of? And Loyalists tended to come from groups that were very elite. They had very strong cultural and economic ties to England. They were royal officials, they were wealthy merchants, they were conservative, urban or city living people, mainly lawyers. And the Patriots were always trying to impress upon them that independence for them would be beneficial. But the Loyalists really saw the Patriots as a very unscrupulous, violent, self-interested group of people who only wanted just to transfer power for the sake of having power. They wanted to have the power in the hands of the radicals And they felt like they didn't know what would happen once the Patriots, the radicals, got power in their hands. So they were a little fearful, the Loyalists were, about what's going to happen to the social system here in the colonies. Because the Loyalists kind of knew where they stood, and they were pretty close to the top. What's going to happen when they tried to challenge or change the traditional form of, of social stratification, if that's a good word that you can understand. Certainly there were some not very wealthy or educated people who remained loyal to the king because they were upset about maybe some patriot landowners. You have farmers who owned land, or who might not have owned land, may have rented land from patriot landowners, and they didn't like the way they were treated. So it's kind of a diverse crowd of loyalists. Certainly the women tried to help as much as they could. You read about them, a few of them trying to hide their identity and become a part of the Continental Army. You have women serving as nurses. You have women who are taking the role of their husbands, brothers, sons, uncles, caretakers of the land, in the farming business, or maybe working in the shops, taking over the role of the men when it comes to the jobs within the colonies. And they were concerned about, what's going to happen to them as a result of this war. So they were as willing to fight for independence because they felt in the end it might help them gain their independence a little bit, or at least, gravitate closer to what would be considered equal rights for women. The Native Americans, that's another important group. But let me go back and let's talk about African Americans, because that you read was pretty clear. In the South, African Americans still doing the jobs on the plantations, but those who could become free tended to want to take the part of a soldier during the Continental Army. So that's probably their greatest contribution, would be fighting during the Revolution when and where they were allowed to do so. And then the American Indians, as we said, tried to stay as neutral as they could. However, there were some groups, and even within New York State, they talked about the Iroquois splitting almost between certain members of the Iroquois tribes helping the British versus helping the Patriots, because depending on where they saw the greatest amount of help for them, for the Native Americans, that's who they tended to side with. If they felt that the British were going to help them keep the colonists out of their land so that more and more settlers wouldn't take over their land, they'd side with the British. If they felt they had a good relationship with some of the Patriots in terms of trading with them and being, kind of an ally to them, then they would side with the colonists. So I think it was a real different kind of look for the Native Americans depending on where they lived and the relationship that they had up to this point with either the British themselves or the colonists. And then they also talked about neutrals, that, many people of the American population tried to stay neutral. Persuasion and force were used on either side, trying to convince them to join either the British or the Patriots. Revolutionaries, the radicals, the Patriots, in control of local governments, punished the Loyalists. They intimidated the neutrals, and they had many persuasive powers. They could try to convince, middle-of-the-road citizens that neutrality was not a comfortable option. The British treatment of prisoners of war was also an issue. Great Britain defended or defined captives as traitors, not as prisoners of war. So more than 15,000 men, you read, endured captivity on these British death ships, they were called, and 2/3 of them died. Many Indians, as I said, tried to stay neutral, but they felt their lives were being threatened too by American settlers and soldiers. So I think the Patriots had a way of making their side be more persuasive, because they had ways of using the majority of these everyday people as committees of correspondence, or they were people who inspected. Sometimes they went into colonist homes themselves and they inspected for contraband, British goods that weren't supposed to be in people's homes at the time. They were helping with the boycotts. They were policing these traders. They were helping to start up militias and choose people to be drafted into the Continental Army. They searched homes. They were in charge of public safety because there was no police, and in towns where the British soldiers weren't, you had to take care of policing your town or your area. So they had quite a bit of, I would say, local power while they were still fighting the British, and it appeared as though, some of these bigger battles made them look less than capable. Within their small towns, villages, and cities, they had quite a bit of power, and that was important in enforcing this loyalty and getting the people to comply with what needed to be done. And then the fifth question, and we kind of talked about this, I think Monday or Tuesday, why did the British decide to restrain themselves when it came to the colonies? Why didn't they just go in for the kill? And we talked about General Howe and General Gates and some of these British commanders. They wanted to regain the loyalty. They didn't want to conquer them. They didn't want to plunder them to the point where they didn't have food, where the towns were destroyed, where people were killed. This was their economy. They had taken a long time to get these colonies to the point of mercantilism and trade, and where they wanted them. They had these colonies, even though they're a great distance, it was very costly to lose them at this point. So they were reluctant to, ravage the countryside, to confiscate food, to destroy the towns, because what they wanted was their loyalty back. They just wanted things back the way that they were. The British, though, however, were not so smart in their belief of the Continental Army. They really underestimated this inexperienced Continental Army. Yes, the British were well trained, well supplied, but they really didn't feel as urgent as going in for the kill in some of those battles that we talked about as they could have. And if they had done that, they might have whittled away the time a little bit that was necessary for the war, as well as, certainly made the morale of the colonists feel a lot worse than it was. They also believed that a lot of the colonists were really still, in their heart of hearts, loyal to the British. So they presumed that the colonists would remain loyal to the crown. And when the British troops came in, that they would aid the British troops. And that didn't happen. So we see happening some challenges of the Continental Army, some challenges of the colonists, but certainly not to the extent that it, cut them out of the war completely. They fought for, nearly 8 years of strong fighting, and the colonists, did a pretty good job defending themselves. So it took a long time, but they did have some ways to overcome the challenges. So those are the first 5 questions. I hope that helps you a little bit. I'm sorry if I talk a lot, but you can always stop and pause. That's the beautiful thing about this. You can stop and pause and take a look at it, and skip over parts if you've already got stuff down that you think you're happy with and it makes sense to you from your reading. So that's it for today. As I said, it's after Thanksgiving. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving, and I hope you have a good rest of the weekend, and we'll see you when we see you. Okay? Thanks.